Hi everyone, welcome to another unboxing with Yoseka. Today we will be unboxing and reviewing the Yoseka Ceramics Watercolors that we have restocked and updated on the website. I have my personal palette as well as the shop palette to review with you guys. We'll be going over a couple of things. We will be talking about the inspiration for the watercolors, my approach and research, as well as how I've created and recreated certain qualities. And then we'll wrap it up with how I use my watercolors as well as how I care for them. Without further ado, let's get started. This watercolor set was created in 2022 for the Travelers Travel and Sketch event last summer. We had also during that same time released the Yoseka Ceramic inks, and it would have been really fun to create watercolors that match the fountain pen inks. But not only do that, I was really hoping to recreate the fountain pen ink qualities, such as sheening and shading, which the Yoseka Ceramic inks do a really great job. It was during this time when I was learning about fountain pen inks, and I was really curious to see if watercolors were able to recreate those qualities. So I took it upon myself and studied our fountain pen inks and then went into researching pigments and how to make those qualities happen. The research started with this book right here, which you probably have seen on our Instagram or maybe on TikTok, but this is my research book. I first took the fountain pen inks and I swatched them on fountain pen paper. This one is Tomoe River paper, and the original idea was to just work off of these and try to make paints based on these swatches. But then I was curious. I was wondering if fountain pen ink behaves similarly on fountain pen paper versus watercolor paper. To my surprise, for a lot of these colors, they did behave similarly. However, with Song Black, the swatch for the ink on watercolor paper is actually more brown than black. So that was when we all collectively made the decision that the watercolors would be color matched to the fountain pen ink on fountain pen paper, specifically Tomoe River paper, because Tomoe River does a really great job at showing the sheening qualities and shading qualities of our inks. Like here you can see Ming Yellow really shading around the corners, and then our Qing Purple sheening a little green here. And then my favorite Ming Kongzhe Blue and Yuanji Blue really sheening red around the edges. So what I did was I took this booklet with me to our local pigment store, Kramer Pigments, and spent maybe 2 hours there picking out all the possible pigments that we could use to recreate these watercolors. And let me tell you, that was probably the most exciting 2 hours of my life. But also, it opened up a really big world of possibilities to make these paints. We ended up using approximately 2 to 3 colors to make each of these watercolors. So these are truly custom blends. You probably will not be able to find them. And quite honestly, they are really hard to recreate as the measurements are never truly exact. The goal is to always get as close to a fountain pen ink swatch and really make sure that the sheening and the shading quality still shows through the watercolor on watercolor paper. You can see how that becomes a little bit challenging, but also it's a tongue twister. So once I've acquired the pigments, I mix it with a watercolor medium, which is made of gum arabic, honey, and glycerin, and then it's mulled down with a glass muller until all the pigments are thoroughly mixed in with the medium. It's a very tedious project, and I'm pretty sure my right arm is now much stronger than my left arm for that specific reason. It's a labor of love. I hope you all enjoy these watercolors and know that every single one of those little pans that you take home with you is blood, sweat, and tears of mine. But like I said, everything is panned into a half pan. This is an updated version. When we first released these, we actually made them in the metal pans. There was more demand for half pans, as a lot of people have these traveling watercolor cases. But also, May did a really great video on how to create your own traveling watercolor case, and she showcases half pans and full pans. So that really inspired us to change the container that our paints are now panned in. The volume of paint is actually the same. The metal pans are much thinner and shorter, so while it is bigger in size, it's actually thinner in depth, so the volume between the two are about the same. These just make a lot easier to travel. So that is the inspiration for the for the watercolors. The process of making them and panning them. They take about 48 hours to 72 hours to dry, and once they're fully dried, they are ready to go and travel. You don't have to worry about it spilling in any way because it is fully dry to the core. This poses a couple of challenges for people who are not familiar with dry watercolors, so I'm going to show you today how I personally use my watercolors and my tips and tricks on how to use these, and also my recommendation for care and maintenance. I'm going to make a couple of swatches to show you how I use them. You've probably seen Alex's amazing video on the swatch comparison between the watercolor and the fountain pen ink. But I'm going to show you my process. I have a brush, a little cup of water, a dry rag for drying my brush before it hits the paper, and then my pan. This is optional. You don't necessarily need a mixing palette, but it can come in handy. But all I really do is I take a brush, and all of these inks are, or these half pans are fully dry, by the way. So we're going to be wetting them and picking up paint. So I'm going to take a wet brush and just apply it onto a dry pan. The first few times, you'll probably want to use a little bit of extra water. Don't be too aggressive with the water though, because these are heavily pigmented. You don't need that much water. That was maybe two brushes full, and I already have I've already picked up quite a bit of pigment. So I'm just going to make a little puddle of ink or paint here and do a very quick pass. So that is the swatch of Qing Yinzhi Red. And I'm gonna do a swatch of Yunji Blue. This one is one of my favorites. It's so heavily saturated and it immediately releases the pigments so nicely. It looks beautiful just in the tray itself. I'm gonna do a quick swatch on paper. I tend to be a wet watercolor painter. What that means is I like to use a lot of water. Not everyone does, that's okay. That's just my personal habit. Like I said, our watercolors are heavily saturated, very, very pigmented. So a little bit goes a long way. If you like to paint dry, you might need to pick up a little bit more, but if you like to paint wet and very translucent, you only need a little bit of pigment and all you need is water. All right, so I've done 2 swatches so far. I'm going to do another swatch here on the left-hand side with the yellow, Ming Yellow. This one is one of my favorites to play with because this is one of the paints that has more granulation, and what that means is it tends to separate from the water a little bit. Not everyone loves that quality, but the texture is so fun to me. It also is the best at creating the shading fountain pen ink quality because of that separating granulation. We'll let those dry, and maybe I'll do one more swatch. I'll swatch our Tangmisa Blue. This one's Daisy's favorite color. Tangmisa Blue is a bit on the drier side. I like to say that it's a little bit drier. And it just means that, you know, the pigment isn't like it's not super saturated. It's not very vibrant. That's because it has a very large portion of Vagone green, which is an earth pigment. And earth pigments sometimes aren't the most saturated. Unlike synthetic pigments, like our blues have a lot of phthalo, which are very synthetic, and that's why they're so bright and beautiful. So if you're looking for a beautiful, earthy, calm color, Tangmisa Blue is going to be one of your favorites. Trust me on that. So I'm gonna do just a couple more brush strokes, and we'll let that dry for a little bit. I want to show you these paints on the mixing palette. This in itself is art. This is the swatch we did, or the palette we made earlier for Yunji Blue. This I made a little bit earlier with Ming Kongche Blue, and you can actually see, it's not even on paper and you already see these properties, but it's already rimmed and almost haloed with a little bit of red around the edges. And that is the attempt to create the sheening property of water, or of fountain pen inks in the watercolor. Then we have here the Ming Yellow, and you'll see that in the center it's very clear, but around the edges it's denser, it's darker, and that was the attempt to create shading in watercolors. All right, so we have some dryness happening here. This is probably the fault of me being a wet watercolor painter, but I still have a lot of wet watercolor that needs to dry, but it's sufficient to show. Here we have that Qing Yanzhi red swatch we did earlier, and you can see that around the edges, or even where my brush stroke is moving, you can see the granulation, which is also the approach and attempt to create shading. Same thing here with Ming Yellow, and you can see it very, very pronounced in the Tangmisa Blue. This is still wet. Yeah, that's still wet. But you can see that even on these corners that are drying soon, you can really pull the ink away from pull the watercolor away from the paper and let that paper color, which here is white, really shine through the watercolor. And that way you start to show opacity and versus desaturation, and that's another way to achieve the shading quality of fountain pen inks in watercolor. What a mouthful. I want to move on and go over how to care for the watercolors. So mine are locked into this travel palette that is meant and designed for half pans and full pans. Alex has this metal tin here, this metal tin. It's I think a business card holder, or maybe it was already meant to be a watercolor case. I'm not quite sure. Whatever it was meant for, she's also managed to fill hers with half pans as well as full pans. So if you were curious what full pans look like, they are basically twice the length of a half pan. So what she has done is she has put double-sided tape in the case, and then stuck these down. And that is an easy way to keep the paint in place, but also gives you the flexibility to move things around without having to disassemble the whole thing. And finally here we also have the way that we have it displayed in the store for customers to test out. We've just used washi tape and glued it down. If you're curious how other people do it, May does a really great video and has a blog post on how she made her own traveling watercolor case with magnets. So I highly recommend checking that out. You might have noticed that our paints have cracked. And that's actually very normal for dry watercolors that are very highly saturated with pigment. It's kind of the downfall to having really saturated and just dense watercolors instead of mostly medium. Because the solution is more on the drier end, think of it like dough, like batter. If you have more flour, it'll tend to crack, but if you have more liquids, you have a smoother dough. It's the same thing with watercolors, and there's nothing wrong with it. You can still paint with it, it's just not as pretty, but there is another downside, which is if it cracks and it falls out of place, there is a possibility that it will continue to rattle in the case and further fall apart or crack even more. So I'm going to show you how I fix that in my cases. And in fact, my purple is already beginning to separate. So pull this purple out. So as you can see, my purple is very cracked and actually kind of dirty. So it's cracked and it has a little bit of yellow on it, which we'll clean off in a bit. But if I flip this over, my paint falls out. And that can happen. It can happen to paints that have been made very dry. It can happen to paints, if you have a habit of pulling paint from the edges, then it will want to separate from the wall and that will dislodge it from its case. And that's okay because you can glue it back. Yes, you can glue it back. I like to use tacky glue. I have so many of these from my college days that they come in handy once in a while, but also it's water soluble, so it doesn't really affect the paint too much if you use a small amount of it. You can also use paper glue that will also keep your paint in place, but still not affect the quality of the watercolor. Elmer's glue could work too. Elmer's glue is also dissolvable, water soluble, so you don't need anything fancy. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of tacky glue. Let me just bring it down to the bottom of the bottle. And I'm just gonna do a very small dollop of it in the half pan. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of it. So it's just a small dot of glue. All right, maybe it's focused, maybe it's not. And then I'm just going to take this half pan and plop it back onto my square of paint, press it in place, press it down from the top, and let it dry for 15 to 30 seconds and you're good to go, really. You can also, there's no rattling sound anymore, so now it's good to go. So I'm gonna plop that back into my travel case and put it back in place. We saw earlier too that my purple has a little bit of a yellow stain on it. Let's clean it up. All you're gonna do is you're gonna use a clean brush, clean water, and pick up that mixed paint. What that means is you're just going to have a little bit of water in your brush, and I'm just going to swipe over it, clean my brush. It's just the same as picking up the top surface of paint as we were painting earlier. It's the same exact process. You're just wiping the top surface of the watercolor. And once I've picked up the paint with a wet brush, I like to go over with a damp brush to just brush the surface off to make sure that I've gotten everything. And actually, now that I'm looking, I have a little bit of yellow on my Qingyanzhi red. So I'm gonna do the same thing, and I'm gonna go over with a damp brush to wipe down the surface. And that's all set. All right, I've gone over how I use my paints, how I maintain my paints, and how I fix my paints. Let's just go back one more time on the swatch that we made earlier to see the Yunji blue, one of my favorite blues. It's starting to be apparent around the edges that there's shading, but also a little bit of red sheening on it. And it doesn't really show well on the Traveler's watercolor paper, but our Ming Kongzhi blue, our Yuanji blue, and our Qing purple all have shimmering pigments in it. So they're actually kind of metallic. That's why they're just priced ever so slightly more than the others. I highly encourage you to grab one and try it, or come by the shop and try it out as well. They're really fun to play with, and they're very glittery. And finally, just a little small announcement. In the process of creating the second batch of paints, there was a mistake made. I purchased the wrong pigments, 2 large bags of the wrong pigment. So we created a special color called Brooklyn Blues, which should be hitting the website soon, but please look forward to this little oopsie color. We have an additional 9th color to our 8 color watercolor set, and let us know what you think about it. I have a little Brooklyn Blues paint right here. Here is the swatch. It's just a little bit darker than the regular Ming Kongzhi blue. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was very fun for me to record, and I hope that you can let me know what your favorite color is so far. If you've already had it, what your thoughts are, and hope to see you guys in another video. Thanks. Bye.